record on my computer. Okay. So again, I'm going to talk about the hashtag how am I responsible for famine. Now, when we look at that point, when I look at it for myself, or when I consider if someone else was looking at it, just a general person, like an individual in this world, we might look and say, well, I'm not responsible for famine. Like, I'm not out there trying to, keep food out of people's mouths, or I'm not, causing, storms or droughts or something like that, that's wiping out food supplies or something from that perspective. And yeah, that's true. You and I are not directly, specifically going and doing those things. But something that, you can consider, and this is not just in this context, but it's within the general context of how am I responsible for anything in this world that's not ideal, that I wouldn't want to experience, but that doesn't seem like I'm directly participating in. You may have heard of this concept of the butterfly effect, right? Which is small adjustments in something can create big effects later on. Like they say, the butterfly flapping its wings can cause a tsunami or a hurricane in another part of the world. And it may not be exactly like that, but the point is little things that we do can accumulate into bigger things that affect things on a large scale. For example, let's just take voting for a politician. And when you cast your vote and that politician wins, and then they go and make decisions that affect you and others by, for example, regulating a business or not regulating a business, or shutting down the economy or not shutting down the economy, you can see how something little that you participated in could have a bigger effect. And you may not see how your one little vote was maybe the tipping point, but it's just an illustration of how collectively all the little tiny things that we're all doing collectively can accumulate to that. So from the perspective of, okay, if I wanted a different politician to win, then I could go and start persuading other people to shift their votes towards that politician. So you could have an effect on those things even beyond just your single vote. But let's just look for a moment at the things that we participate in that in themselves are not directly going and causing the famine, but are accepting and allowing conditions that if a famine occurs, then it affects a lot of people, or would even maybe create the conditions of a famine. But before we get into how that actually works, what I'd like to do is go through and look at what is famine actually, before I just start assuming we're all on the same page with that. So I'm gonna, let me share my screen here. Okay. All right, let me pull up the one I have shared. All right, now, probably looking at a Whole Foods thing. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So let's look at this for a moment. The word famine. Famine is a widespread scarcity of food caused by several factors, including war, inflation, crop failure, population imbalance, or governmental policies. But when we look at the actual definition, I was reading over here on the side from the Wikipedia, but when we look at the actual definition on Google, it just says an extreme scarcity of food. Let's pop it open and see what else we get here. A shortage. And then, oh, this is interesting. In the origin of the word, the etymology comes from the word fame, which is Old French and Latin, fames, which basically means hunger, right? So we have basically the concept of hunger. And famine itself, obviously, is when we consider an extreme scarcity of food, and that would obviously be the cause of hunger in this particular case. So how am I responsible for that? Let's look at this for a moment. Let me pull this down so I can access the browser. Here we go. There's Anderson Cooper asking me if I want things summarized. I'm good. All right, so I just happened to see this when I was searching the word famine. Coronavirus pandemic will cause global famines of biblical proportions. Now, why would that be the case? Because we would think that it's just it's an illness, right? Why would that cause a problem? But look, an economic recession, a decline in aid, and a collapse in oil prices. What does that exactly have to do with the coronavirus itself? Is it the coronavirus that's in there, like as a little virus going in there and destroying food? Or is it our response as human beings to the coronavirus? Because what's fascinating? So it says in about 36 countries, 10 of those countries already have more than 1 million people on the verge of already have more than 1 million people on the verge of starvation. But that this is going to lead to vast food shortages. 135 million people facing crisis levels of hunger or worse. The updated projections nearly double that number. When added to the 821 million people already chronically hungry, that scenario would push more than 1 billion people into dire situations. So if you think that, oh, this famine is occurring because of the coronavirus, that's only 135 million out of the already 820 million. So 135 million out of a billion. So you're not even talking, they're talking less than 15%, right? Out of the people that are already existing in a state of hunger right now. So this was already occurring before the coronavirus. I just want to make that clear. But here we have an example of famines, right? But already chronically, there's 821 million people already experiencing famine on a regular basis. So the idea of a famine being something that like strikes and happens, like we've been programmed with that image through a lot of things like media, TV shows. I remember specifically as a kid, I didn't grow up in a very religious household, but when I would go and visit certain relatives, like my grandmother, for example, like we would watch these Bible story like cartoons for kids. And I remember one of them being about, the whole thing with Moses and Egypt and where, they had the plagues and all that. And I think famine was one of those, if I'm not mistaken. Right. But that kind of becomes like an image in my mind as something that it can happen in a moment. But we already have 821 million people chronically hungry. I mean, that's, that there's 7 billion people on the planet. We're talking basically a seventh, right? So you're looking at like, what is that, 16% or something like that already. If you add in the new 135 million people, but even 821 million people out of the current already 7 billion people are already experiencing this on a regular basis. So why are we not considering that? And why are we not considering on a regular basis ourselves individually how we could do something to prevent it? Now, we might feel in a moment powerless to do something about it. We might feel like there's nothing I can do. These are situations that exist because of all number of reasons that have nothing to do with what I do or don't do on a daily basis. But if we're honest with ourselves, even if that were true, that meaning it's not what we're specifically doing on a daily basis, it's like, are we even concerned about it on any kind of regular basis? Are we actually even within ourselves interested in, is this problem being solved? Like, is it getting better? Is it not getting better? I mean, is there anything I can do about it? Because if you look at it, why is it that we're not able to feed everybody in the world on a regular, consistent basis? And is it possible that we could create systems that would do that, that would make sure no child, no person goes without food on a regular, like at all ever? I mean, I would think we could do that. And so how am I responsible would be from the perspective of not really caring enough to really investigate and see, okay, is it possible? And then what can I personally do about it? So there's a lot of ways from my perspective, having walked a process of looking at these things and investigating for myself long enough anyways, to be able to see a lot of options for any individual person, generally speaking. And there are still many cases where a person, there's not much they can really do to change their situation. But generally, from my perspective, that would be the people who are in the famine situation. I mean, there's not much those people could do to make a difference. So who am I really talking to is people in a relatively similar situation to me, people in the first world. Because whether you realize it or not, and I hope at least maybe from watching this video, you start to realize this, is that we are the reason why these famines are continuing to exist and are not being solved. And again, it's not because we have the intention of, I want to hurt people or I want people to starve or something like that, but it's simply because we're participating in systems that benefit us, that we would never really, just practically speaking, have to ever face any kind of level of famine, right? Assuming the system continues working. But there's a lot of people. I mean, can you imagine how many people is 821 million people? I mean, have you even ever seen that many people in one picture? You know, like I've been to, like when I was in college, we'd go to football games, you know, and I'm thinking maybe there'd be like 20,000 people. I don't know, like how big is a football stadium, you know? There's probably stadiums that fill, you know, 50,000 people or something. And I mean, that seems like a lot of, can you imagine all those people and you're just looking at them all in one area and they're just literally all starving to death and you're just sitting there watching it. That's 50,000 people, right? And think of 10 of those stadiums, that'd be 500,000 people. 100 of those stadiums, what would that be? 5 million. 1,000 of those, 50 million. 10,000 of those, 500 million. And we're still not, 10,000 football stadiums filled with 50,000 people. And you're just watching them all just starving to death. That's literally going on right now. And there's actually more people chronically hungry existing right now than even that scenario. And we can't even like really imagine that. And this really gets to part of the problem, which is because we don't have access like to all information that exists like in real time, like everything going on in reality. It's like all we can see right now is just like what's in this room. Like I can see, I have some books, I have a window there, I have the walls in my office, I have a whiteboard, I have my desk, my computer, you know, I have my coffee cup right here. You know, I can look out my window, I can see my backyard, I can see my neighbor's yards, I can go downstairs and see my family, I can go drive around my city. But just in a practical, you know, I could get on a plane and I could go travel, right? But that takes a lot of effort. You know, it's not like I'm just going to be doing that every day necessarily, depending on what I do for work or what you do. But even if you do, if you're doing it for work, you're probably not traveling to the areas where people are starving to death. So you're not really going to be seeing this stuff on a regular basis. And yet it's happening right now. So another thing I wanted to share, because I was just looking at this point as I was preparing for the video. Let's see, let me get back here. Was what I had originally on the screen. Let me share that. Let's see here. Because I just went onto my Amazon account, right? And check it out, right? This is just what is popped up. I don't even use this. My account's connected to my wife, Katie's account. She's the one who does our shopping and so forth, right? And we don't always use this service, but we have many times in the past. And look, I could go on the internet and I could just buy some corn, right? Like I could just go on here. Hey, I want some salami, right? I want some chocolate chip cookies, right? What else do I want? Some duck trap smoked Atlantic salmon. Hey, some pork ribs, right? Okra, avocados, top wine picks. I don't even drink wine, so I'm not sure why they're showing me that. Maybe that's because I never used this, so it doesn't know my preferences yet. Produce, meat and seafood. I can get some bacon. I can get some organic hot dogs, right? Look at this. Half and half, cream, whole milk, organic, mango, frozen mango. I could probably get pretty much anything I want. Look, I can get some fresh flowers. Look at that. Let's see how long it takes. Does it tell me? Free delivery. I'm assuming that will take, I don't really want to add it to my cart and show all my address and all that stuff, so I'm not going to do that right now, but I'm assuming I can get these today, right? I know how this works. You can get this stuff today in a couple of hours. And I mean, look, just anything you want. Anything I want. If I need it, I can get it. I mean, look, sparkling water, right? How many people don't have access to water? Oh, wow. 800, 780 million people do not have access to an improved water source. An estimated 2.5 billion people lack access to improved sanitation. And here we are in the first world. We have this apparent pandemic thing, and everyone's like, got to wash their hands and get the sanitizer and clean everything and sanitize everything and wash all the services all the time. And these people don't even have like running water. How many people in the US don't have clean drinking water? Wow. 1.6 million Americans don't have running water or indoor plumbing. Did not know that. And I like when people say, oh, look, 71%, we should be positive about that. That's great. Look, why focus on the negative? It's like, well, if you're on the negative side, that's your fucking reality. So yeah, you could just focus on the positive, but that's actually a really cool point, because if I look at these numbers and I go, but let's focus on the positive. Look at the 71% who do have clean water. Isn't that amazing? And then I just go right back to my life and I go back right to participate in the system, because I'm in that 71%, not realizing how I'm using money. And that money is part of a larger economic system based on currency valuations, where people in one country, if I take one of my dollars and I go to their country, it's worth 10, 20, 30, 50 maybe of their dollars. You know, and I can actually take 10 of their apples for one of my apples. It's like literally I could just walk in there. Like if I think about, if I took that money and I bought an apple here, what if instead I went to their country and I took that dollar or whatever, how much it was for a dollar or for an apple rather, and I went to their country and I just bought 10 apples. Of course, it's inconvenient for me to just go and fly to their country to buy an apple. So I just order it online. And all these apples that are coming out of these countries where there's people like, think of all the avocados that come to our country, right? Let's see, hunger in Mexico. I wonder what the statistics are around that. 10% of all residents in Mexico experience poor access to food, while inadequate food access affects between 25 to 35% of the population in 9 states. And yet I can get their avocados. Does that make sense? Why aren't their avocados going to their people? Right? But if someone's in Mexico building an avocado farm, are they going to sell it cheap to the Mexicans, or are they going to sell it to me with my American dollars, for example? And or sell it to Whole Foods or wherever the distributor is. So how am I participating in these systems so that I'm exploiting the fact that I live in a system in the context of the system of America, for example, or what we would call the first world, where my currency is valued more highly. And that's just one way in which something I'm benefiting from exploits something on another side. So in other words, to me, the 71% is the positive part, but that creates the negative part because the 31% are going without. You know, that's the context of clean water, for example. Why isn't it that everyone has access to that? And it's easy for our mind to immediately jump to, well, it's because they have a dictator or they have this corrupt politicians or whatever. And yet, if you go and look at it, we're giving money to those countries. And yet we're not demanding that things change because we could change them. Of course, if the education level of a population is very low, then they're not going to be able to sustain a democracy, which means why aren't we focusing on the education levels of those populations? Why aren't we really actually supporting them to be educated? So what can I do about that? Well, I'm already working on that part, right? But in terms of what can I do about the money system? What can you do about the money system? Well, there may not be much that we can do right this moment. But we could start investigating and asking ourselves, well, how would those things change? What is it that's creating the rules around money so that these things are made possible, so that these things happen? Is it laws? Is it politics? Is it treaties? Is it economic deals and so forth? And are the people in the positions to be making those deals doing it from the perspective of what's best for everybody and making sure, like, let me give you an example. So let's say I were to do a business deal. Am I going to do a business deal where I lose? Would that make sense? Like, unless I'm just a terrible negotiator, but I'm saying, would my starting point going into it be, I'm going to lose? If you were in a business, would you do that? Or would you be like, no, I need to win? Now, you could say, well, I need to win and the other person needs to win. And that would make sense because they'll be more likely to do business with you again. And it may be even a situation where if you do that, you can get more. Or maybe you just feel good about it and you just don't want to take advantage of it. But are you then saying, well, I'm only going to do the business deals where I win, the other person wins, but then literally everybody else on the planet who would be affected by this decision, either directly or indirectly through the long-term consequences or the way in which it might redirect resources so that someone now goes without over here, even though they weren't directly involved with what I'm doing. I'm going to make sure everyone wins. Are the politicians doing it from that perspective? Or are they like, okay, what helps me get reelected? What will help the people that are in my area that I can influence? And what helps like the people that help to get me elected, meaning like the corporation that donated me to me or the people who donated to me. But are they considering, okay, what's the actual real full consequences of this decision? Not just for Florida or Texas or the state I represent or the district or the county I represent, but how does it affect everything? And if you think, well, people couldn't possibly process information at that level, well, yeah, that's part of the problem too. And so how are we just going along with the school system? How are we just going along with the way the education system is designed so that it produces people who just memorize things and they can go get a job and then just go follow orders rather than actually looking at the context of everything that they're affecting? How are the little things that I do on a daily basis affecting all of these points? Now, if you or I were to just stop using Whole Foods or Amazon delivery, is that going to change the system? No. And you might think, well, okay, but if I stop doing it, other people will stop doing it. But really? Is that really what's going to happen? I hear people say like, well, if I don't use plastic bottles, then that's a good example. And that may be the case. Now, whether you use the plastic bottles or not, if you want to not use them, don't use them. But if you think that just by you not doing it, maybe talking to a few people, that's going to change anything, it's not, because the system is designed in a way where it's going to continue impulsing the point. It's going to make the plastic bottles so much cheaper than just having a filtering system in your house like we have, right? We have a $10,000 water filtration system in the house, so we don't need plastic bottles. But is everyone going to be able to have access to that? And, it may actually cost you more money in the long run to keep buying plastic bottles. But if you don't have access to be able to get the system right up front or whatever, or finance it or whatever, that may be your only choice. It's cheaper in the moment, for example. So what does that person do? Is that a solution? Why isn't the water that's coming into our pipes just already filtered, free of chlorine and fluorine and all this shit that probably, I don't know, shouldn't be in there, the stuff that we're filtering out? And then why doesn't everyone have access to the proper minerals, to be able to take in their body, and vitamins and so forth? So after you strip everything out of the water, you can have something put back into it, for example. But these things aren't being considered at any level, really. It's just whatever is expedient for a person in their particular context of their reality. And so, if you look at things from the perspective of how easy it is for us just to, in our life, in our individual lives, only really think about what serves me right now. And if you put yourself in the context of a politician, they're doing something that's no different. And so it's very easy for us to go and then judge the politicians and be like, oh, they're just these corrupt, assholes and all this stuff. But fundamentally, they have the same starting point in their life. And what they're doing is just a job, like you go to your job, and you don't question what you do on a regular basis and how it affects everything. They don't either. And yet they will say they do because that's how they get elected. Like they act like they care and they're going to help everybody and all this stuff, but it just doesn't happen by and large. And there are politicians who care, and there are doctors who care, and there are teachers who care, and so forth. But the problem is the systems, which is what produces the automatic results, the unconsciously automatic results. It's like, I have a system in my house, like I can hear my air conditioner blowing through the vent right there. It automatically regulates the temperature. So even if for a moment I built a fire right here and it got really warm, eventually that fire is going to go out. And what's going to happen is eventually the air is going to cool back down. So if it's based on just what you do individually in a moment, the system is always going to bring it back to the equilibrium point that it's set at. That's what a thermostat is designed for. And so our system, all the systems in our world, which are just part of the general system, And sometimes people say, like, what do you mean by the system, right? What is a system? It's just relationships between interconnected parts that produce some kind of result. That's all it is. And generally, it's a result that's predictable based on understanding the functioning of that system. And so to say that there's no system that runs our world is like totally ridiculous, because you can go to the supermarket and there's food there. And how much actual literal individual effort did you put in to make sure that food was there and that it showed up there? Basically nothing. You went to work and you got money at some job that probably has nothing to do with that supermarket existing. And yet, what is it a part of? The money system. And the supermarket's a part of the money system. And so that's the larger system that's connecting all these points. So that makes it just happen automatically. And so whatever job you're going to is producing some result that other people are now expecting automatically. So as the first world, we just expect these things. Just like you expect that you're going to breathe. Like, you don't even think about it. It just happens automatically. It's a system. There's a system in your body that breathes for you. You're not really like thinking about it consciously. So my question is for all of us is like, how can we take more responsibility? So let's just shift for a moment. And instead of saying, from the context which I've been sort of addressing so far, is the context of how am I to blame for famine? Now the question should be shifted to, how can I take responsibility for famine? And depending on the context of where you're at currently in your life, but more specifically in your process of self-awareness as to who you are, why you exist, and what you've decided for yourself as to why you exist, not in the search for why I exist, not the search for an answer to why I exist, but the actual decision process of deciding and living who I am, who I decide to be. In that process, depending on where you're at within that context, you'll have a different level of responsibility that you can take physically in this moment towards these issues, but also that you can even see as possible. And so what I've found for myself personally is that the more I walk the process of, when I see a point of responsibility, moving towards it and figuring out, what do I need to forgive within myself so that I'm able to take responsibility in that point without continuing to inject the past into it and just recreating what already exists, just in another form, but with the same starting point, which requires a lot of honesty within myself to be able to see, like, okay, what really was my starting point? What really was I doing? And self-honesty also applies to things generally. So when we're looking at this context of famine, self-honesty is not just meaning, it's not just what am I doing? It's the self-honesty of the system itself. Because I'll give you an example of the contrast between self-honesty versus not participating in self-honesty, which in this context, which would be like, well, the world is the way it is because that's just how it is. Or some people have to be poor. There's always gonna be people who are poor. Or some people just are lazy and they don't want to do it. So, they suffer and they starve, and they could take responsibility if they wanted to. All of those statements are not being totally self-honest, because you're not really digging past that point to, okay, but why are people lazy? And I mean, is it the lazy people who are suffering from lack of water in any case? But even if it was, why are they lazy? What was their education? What was their background? What were their parents like? Why were their parents like that? Why was their environment in such a way that it impulsed them and created a character within them of laziness, for example? Because there's always a cause for whatever effect that you see. And so the self-honesty aspect is looking at the effect, but then going past it and seeing, what is the cause? What is the cause? What is the cause? And then finding, where is that cause that I can forgive, and stop accepting that cause. Stop accepting that as it has to be so. Because if we truly are all creators, then we should be able to do that. And instead of looking for forgiveness from above and looking for the cause of creation outside of ourselves, what if we accept that responsibility as we are the creators of this reality and this existence and its current context? Meaning, perhaps we're not certain how we created the trees, but we can be certain, if we apply ourselves and we really discipline ourselves to keep investigating, we can trace back, how am I responsible for participating in the economic system, and what could I do differently? And I'm not here to give you the answer to what you could do, because you'll have to investigate that for yourself and see, what are your skill sets? What is the context of your current reality, and what freedom of movement do you have? What are your limitations, and can you go past those limitations, and how much, and so forth, and how can you expand? And then in that new expanded state, how can you expand further, and so forth? That's a very personal process, as it has been for me. It's personal from the perspective of someone else is not directly in my position point in this reality. I'm here to take responsibility for this point that I'm at, and you're in your position to take responsibility for that. But for those who might be listening to me and resonating with the point of politics and economics, and seeing that there may be some potential that you see inside of yourself to stand up in those positions, well, then you could consider that. That's what I would like to do, is stand in higher and higher positions in that. That's what I will do. I will push myself within. That's my commitment within the context of how am I responsible, is really looking at it for myself from the perspective of how far can I go? How far can I go within taking responsibility for ending famine? And maybe it's not, I'm going to be the person that writes the law that says, this is the final point that ends all famine. But maybe it's, I'm going to be the politician who stands up and talks about it from the context of like I'm talking about it right now. So people can say, yeah, why are we accepting this? This is so silly. Like, we should really be looking at how we can connect everything in a way that it is balanced and equal for everyone, from the perspective of everyone has what they need. And then let's improve upon that. Like, let's not just bring everything down to the lowest point, which is the way the idea of equality is commonly manipulated in politics, right? The promise is everyone will have what they need, and then it just, everything's brought down. But of course, there's a whole game that's being played there. And then you have the other side where everyone says, let's just tell everybody they're totally responsible for themselves, and you figure it out, and it's your choice of whether you stand up and take more responsibility in your life or not, which is true at a certain level, right? But without the proper education, without the proper tools and so forth, that's very difficult. So for anybody who's watching this outside of the group that I was making this video for, my suggestion would be for you to look into Destiny, DESTENI.org, and check out the Destiny I process. Because those are sets of tools that will support you to be able to take more responsibility within yourself, to let go of the past, and to support yourself to start making the changes where you can take more responsibility, but not just from the perspective of feeling like you are, like feeling like you're a good person, feeling like you're a better person, like actually being able to challenge those points within you that are currently keeping you in a way limited within the current context of just where you are, which is in essence a victim to the system that we live in. So in the same sense that you have people dying of starvation or not having a clean water, they're victims to that circumstance. Everyone in this world is a victim to the degree that they're in the context, they're limited by how much money they have, by their education, by what programming their parents put into them. But we, for the first time in human history, in perhaps the history of the universe, we have the opportunity with the tools that I'm suggesting to take responsibility. And instead of just going along with the programming of the victim, we can change that programming into being an equal as life and being here as like a living expression of what is actually best, and not just accepting I'm a victim, and creating more of that and victimizing other people. Because think about it, we feel victims to our current situation, and yet we don't consider the victimization we're creating by continuing in that role. So if I sit and I say, well, my life sucks, none of my friends like me, my family doesn't, they argue with me all the time, and I drink too much, I sleep too much, I'm bored, I'm not happy, I don't feel fulfilled in my life, and all these things. But here I am on Amazon, like getting food delivered to my door, or going to Walmart and getting whatever I need, whatever context is in your reality. Meanwhile, there's other people in the world who are like, literally, they can't even get clean water. By me continuing to participate in my victim state, in my reality, I'm still contributing to a system that's creating much more victimhood over here, but then is also creating the current context of my reality, because everything is interconnected. Because if my parents had had a higher level of education, and I mean in the context of self-honesty, understanding how a child really develops and how much you influence a child through how you interact with them, and especially in the early stages of their life. I don't just mean like what school you went to. If they had understood that, then you would have a different experience of yourself right now. You would be capable of much more. So we have a choice now at this point in history for and for a lot of for many different reasons. For example, the context of this global pandemic, I think it's an opportunity for a lot of people to start waking up. It's like this big shock. It's like one day everything seemed okay, and then suddenly everything has changed. And I think a lot of people are experiencing that. To me, it's not a shock at all. It's like, yeah, I was just wondering when this was going to happen because I can see where things are going. That doesn't mean I'm going to sit and like just wait for it, but I could see eventually the economy is going to collapse. I mean, it's like anybody who's really looking at these points is not surprised at all. But it's for those who were just going along with their lives, especially in the first world. I think for many people, it's like a wake up call. And for many people, it's just everything's terrible. And it's like they're living in a movie and they're not really going to necessarily change anything because of it. But instead of accepting that, we can say, well, how can we look for those people who are starting to wake up? And how can we present the tools that we've been using that have supported us to change over time so that they can support themselves and then they can start supporting other people? Because that is the way that the world is going to change. And then through that, those who decide to can get into, let's say, higher and higher positions of responsibility in this world so that the laws and the economic systems and the currencies and all those things I was talking about can be adjusted so that those people who are in the situations where they literally can't do anything because not only do they have to just focus all day on survival, but because of the conditions of the environment they were brought up in, their nutrition was at a level where their brain didn't even develop to the full potential that it should be. So like they literally have limitations physically in their body because of lack of proper nutrition and hygiene and things like that. So there's not much they can do in the context of trying to change a system that is highly competitive, that like if you want to be at the top levels to actually make the change, you have to be like an Olympic level athlete, like in that context. It's like if you want to change the systems that distribute food in this world, well, what's the main system that's distributing food in the world right now? Let's say in the context of the first world, or let's say in the US, you could say it's Amazon. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more players within it, but let's just use that as an example. Now you have to go into that world and see how that can be adjusted, which means you have to be at the same level as Jeff Bezos. You have to be equal within that point. So if we're not already in that, that means we have work to do. And again, that path is not necessarily for everyone. For some people, the path for them might be, for example, being an effective parent, like mother or father, for your kids to give them the proper education, because that's required too. Or it might be being a lawyer or something else. Or it might be being a doctor and then finding out how the medical system can be adjusted and so forth so that people are getting, whatever changes are required so that they're preventing disease and not just relying on, a pharmaceutical drug after a condition's already created, for example, just as an example, right? But of course, a lot of that's going to have to do with the laws that are in place. So you're going to require to network and be connected with other people who have, political skills and legal skills and things like that, but from the point of principle where they want to truly do what's best for all. So when I look at that point of how am I responsible for famine, we can look at the point of how are we to blame for it, which is why many of us just immediately shut off and don't want to look further at and be self-honest. But that's just self-judgment. So we have to forgive the self-judgment. And then we can look at, okay, how can I take responsibility? So I can't tell you the answer to how you can take responsibility in that specific context, because it'll depend on your context of reality. But I can tell you how you can take responsibility from the perspective of whatever path you do take, what are going to be the key tools to being able to actually take real responsibility within that, and then expanding yourself so you can see even more opportunities and possibilities. And that's the Destiny Tools. So I'll place a comment below with the link to that, and so you can check that out. Okay, so that's all for now, and I hope that was enjoyable, and I'll see you on the next one.